So before we get into the elections, can you please set the scene as to what Brazil's next president will inherit as it pertains to the country's economic situation? And maybe we can start with you, Cecilia.
Yeah, more than happy. I would say that initially we definitely expected Brazil to somewhat suffer from the initial tensions that broke out between Russia and Ukraine. But what we saw in this first semester of 2022 was actually a much more resilient than expected activity coming out of Brazil's economy. So you can see here that month after month, we have made upward revisions to Brazil's economic activity, to Brazil's GDP. So at the moment, we do expect Brazil to grow at about 2.2% this year. And I would say that where we've seen the most surprise has really been from this consumer spending story. Definitely, we expected consumers to be much more held back by the higher than average inflation that we've seen over the course of this year. But overall, retail activity, consumer spending patterns have been much more resilient than what we initially expected. No doubt also aided by this latest cash transfer boost that we've just seen approved by the Brazilian Congress. And actually, it's really been sustaining the overall activities that we've seen since this past semester. So much so that we can see that across the board, while we've seen Latin America as a whole outperforming these market expectations, Brazil has been one of the countries that has most outperformed these market expectations as a whole. So you can see here that Colombia has definitely been one of the countries that has most led this outperformance, has really surprised to the upside. But when we look at Brazil, has really been one of the countries that has really outperformed these growth expectations, both in Q1 and Q2. So this is where the market consensus really was back in March of earlier this year. But this is what the actual growth in Q1 and Q2 was. And again, I would say that really this higher than expected growth has been really concentrated on a consumer spending story. Exports really continue to be resilient, but also on the investment side as well. We really don't see markets still being on this wait and see approach. If anything, companies really continue to investing regardless of the political uncertainty that we continue to see, really shaping this overall story for 2022.
Interesting, and I would actually be curious to see whether our clients had felt this revenue-wise. So I want to propose that we launch the first polling question of the day, and just to make sure this is totally anonymous and it will help us guide the conversation. So here you have the question. So how has revenue growth been so far in Brazil in 2022 and measuring local currency, not in US dollars, as we've seen a lot of volatility there? So has it been much better than expected, all the way to much worse than expected? So we'll leave it open for maybe 20 more seconds. Okay, so I think it's safe to close it now. Okay, as expected, 50% and the other 50 better than expected. So there's a clear bias, I guess, towards outperformance here. And I think it's interesting, not just from an economic and business standpoint, but also politically and socially. And everywhere you look in Latin, there seems to be potential disruption, right? Whether you're talking about Colombia with Petro, Mexico with AMLO, and Peru with Castillo being impeached for the third time, at least that attempt for the third time, the resignation of 2 finance ministers in a matter of 2 weeks in Argentina, the rejection of Chile's new constitution. And we've seen violent protests across the region, in Peru, in Argentina, more recently in Panama, and of course in Colombia in 2021 and back in 2019 in Chile. But we haven't seen any of this in Brazil as of late. So Maruk, in your view, how does Brazil fit within this regional context? Has Brazil been more resilient? And if so, do you think this could change in the short to medium term?
So Brazil always comes across as more resilient. Partly it has the advantage of its size, it has a very diversified economy, but also due to a very long tradition of institutional continuity, even through crises. So unlike many of the other countries in Latin America, this is typical in Brazil, it never swings too far on the pendulum. In 2002, Brazil was amongst the first Latin American countries to elect a left-leaning progressive leader, would later become the so-called pink tide. 20 years later, in 2022, Brazil is one of the last that is going to elect probably, if Lula wins, elect a leftist leader. And in that sense, Brazil will finally then align with its neighbors in both ideological and political terms. Bolsonaro has always sort of tended to ignore the region, and even more once electoral wins were for the left in the rest of Latin America. Yet the region can't ignore Brazil. And should Bolsonaro manage to disrupt the democratic institutional arrangements, which, by the way, I don't think he will, it would have worrying implications for regional stability. And thus, everyone in Latin America wants to see the result, as perhaps in many other parts of the world. A Lula victory would certainly bring back an era of more regional cooperation, even if not necessarily excellent results from that cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so definitely all eyes in Brazil right now. And when it comes to social stability, our hypothesis is that this is mostly grounded on the type of economical performance that we saw during the pandemic. The fact that Brazil in Latin was the country that spent the most as percentage of GDP. So Cecilia, do you think that Brazil will continue to beat expectations in 2023? Because we're going to be talking the sustainability of some of these policies, but off the bat, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it definitely outperformed expectations in 2022, but I think there's definitely been some structural damages that came to light over the course of the pandemic or were exacerbated over the course of these past years that we're going to have to come to terms with over the course of the next 12 to 18 months. And because of that, we really do expect some significant level of slowdown coming into the next year. So as a result, we do expect Brazil to grow at a much more moderate pace into 2023. So you can see here that we do expect Brazil to grow at about 0.8%, and it fits this larger narrative within this Latin American context that we are expecting most countries to grow at a much more moderate pace, both as a result of international elements, as international dynamics, but also as a result of some of these structural elements that still very much will have to come to terms with and will have to grapple into 2023 as we kick this can down the road. And I would say that very much this is also going to be a story that's going to be dictated by these inflation dynamics that we'll still have to come to terms with. Overall, we expect this inflation story to be better into 2023, but it still will have implication on some of these purchasing power dynamics. Well, especially within the Brazilian context, we've seen that more and more Brazilians are tapping into their savings to sustain their current levels of consumption, or to better yet, pay the high levels of indebtedness that Brazilian families have accumulated over the course of these past 2 years. And overall, we're also seeing that even though Brazilian families are now getting back to pre-pandemic levels of wages, so we're starting to get to a place where we're no longer as price sensitive as we used to be over the course of these past 2 years, that does create a more fragile consumer spending story for the next 2023 calendar year.
Okay. And we're going to be comparing the policy platforms of Lula and Bolsonaro in just a few minutes. But something that has become clear is that they both want to maintain social spending, not necessarily at current levels, but at high levels, let's put it this way.
Hi, my name is Krista Reganey, and I'm Marketing Director here at FrontierView. I'd like to thank you for watching a segment of this webinar. If you'd like access to the full video and our latest insights, data, and research, sign up for a free trial with us today. Simply scan the QR code on the screen.